Rock and Roll is the 10th episode of the 4th series based on the story of the same name from the Railway series book, The Little Old Engine. This episode gives us a deeper dive into Duncan's personality and gives us his first derailment. Scarlowe loves all the sounds and sights along the line and knows them very well. One morning he tells Rusty the railway looks drastically different because of the recent repairs to the rails. Rusty explains that the manager had planned to give Scarlowe a surprise, namely the repaired rails upon his return. Rusty however warns Scarlowe that there's still one bit of bad track just outside the first station. He is also worried that Duncan, with his habit of rock and roll, will derail there. Duncan overhears the end of the engine's conversation and demands to know why they are talking about him. Rusty attempts to warn him, but Duncan dismisses the warning and rudely calls Rusty a smelly diesel. Duncan collects some coaches and arrives at the station, where James is waiting for him. When Duncan exclaims his grievances with Rusty, James tells him about Diesel, the lies he told to frame Doug, and claims credit for sending Diesel packing. Filled with admiration and unaware that James was bragging and is not always honest, Duncan becomes more reckless, seeing Rusty's warning as just a joke and begins to rock and roll. This ultimately causes him to derail when he reaches the damaged track Rusty had warned him about just before reaching the first station. When called to help, Rusty initially refuses, until Scarlowe expresses disappointment at him for leaving the passengers stranded. Upon being reminded of the passengers, Rusty's mood quickly changes and he sets off for some workmen. Duncan now feels sad and thinks that everyone will know how silly he is. As soon as Rusty arrives, the workmen, with the help of some passengers, who are not very pleased about the derailment, work hard to lever Duncan back onto the rails. Duncan finishes his journey without any further mishaps, and that evening apologises to Rusty and asks if they could be friends. Rusty agrees and promises to mend the damaged track in the morning. Holm at last took the time to introduce us to Duncan and the type of engine he is, and this episode dives deeper into his personality and the things that make him tick. We also get a deep dive into Duncan's dislikement for diesels, most likely a prejudice due to some sort of bad experience he may have had in a previous railway, but because we don't really know about his past and which railway he came from before coming to Sodor, it's left to us to fill in the gaps ourselves. But the way Duncan speaks to Rusty is just so plain rude. But because of Michelangelis' performance, you don't take it too seriously. I always just found it amusing how he performed the line. It's just done in such a rude yet humorous way you can't help but fall in love with the guy.
I'm a plain speaking engine and I believe in plain speaking. Speak up. Rusty warned Duncan about the bad bit of line. Grunted Duncan. I know my way about. I don't need smelly diesels to tell me what to do, twat.
And it would make sense to even complain about Rusty to James, since James also has a prejudice with diesels.
You're late, he snapped. No, said Duncan. It's that smelly diesel's fault. Rusty tries to teach me how to stay on the rails and then goes off leaving me to find my own coaches. You poor engine, sympathised James. I know all about diesels. One crept into our yard and ordered us about. I soon sent him packing. Duncan was filled with admiration. He didn't know that James was boastful and sometimes didn't tell the truth.
And it gives us a nice callback to the events of Dirty Work and A Close Shave from Series 2. And of course bringing back James's being boastful and not always telling the truth thing. While James and Duncan do have a couple more interactions during the hit era of the series, I do wish that we got more time with them in the Classics series. Just thinking about all the possible plot scenarios these two could have had with each other, especially with their dislike for diesels, and possibly with Duncan helping James to overcome his prejudice. Sadly we never got that, but it is fun to imagine what could have happened then. Duncan's theme is one of my favourite themes composed by Michael Donnell and Jr. Campbell. Like every character theme in the show, this one really sums up the kind of engine Duncan is. It really brings out his stubbornness. I also love the scene where Rusty initially refuses to help Duncan because of the rude name he called him, showing that Rusty can often hold a grudge if he's feeling very, very hurt. And of course it takes Scarlowe reminded him that they got passengers to think about, which immediately has Rusty deciding that they gotta help the passengers, showing us that while Rusty doesn't take very kindly to having his feelings hurt and being called rude names, and he'll still help out for the passengers' sake. Just showing us how kindly and helpful Rusty is as an engine. And his act of heroism does sort of help Duncan to get over his prejudice with diesels, until he lapses back a couple of episodes later, but we'll get to that when we get to that. It's also a really nice touch how they got the passengers to help the workmen out with putting Duncan back on the rails. And this has often happened on railways as far as I've known from research, where the workmen have had to try and get the engines back onto the rails, and sometimes the passengers would have to get out and help as well. Because the locos are so heavy, they need a lot of muscle power to try and get it back on the line. So they would have needed all the help they could get with putting these engines back on the tracks. And I can't even begin to imagine how they managed to achieve Duncan derailing on that one bit of line, and how many takes they must have done to get it right. Just shows how dedicated the team were to getting the scenes just right for this TV series. And it's one of those tame but still entertaining derailments that we often get from the TV series. An accident that doesn't cause any of the passengers or the crew any harm, but it's still one that has to be dealt with as carefully as possible. And I love it. Rock and Roll is another personal favourite of mine because of how it gives Duncan more time to shine in the spotlight, and how we get a deeper dive into his persona. It's another episode that I recommend checking out if you haven't seen it for ages. You'll get a nice derailment, good moments with Duncan and Rusty, and a lovely interaction between Duncan and James. It's an episode that's definitely not to be missed if you love Duncan.
Twat.